get a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning now. Okay, as we have an apparent serious oxygen leak. 4, 3, 2, 1. Houston, we've had a problem. He's in a roll and he can't stop it. Performing an evasive maneuver. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. Welcome to space.
Hello, listener, and welcome to Failure to Launch, the space history podcast where we walk you through every mistake, failure, and explosion that made modern space exploration possible. We are your hosts, Quinn, he, him.
Chris, he, him.
Kyle, he, him.
And to sleep, your Chris, he, him.
And today we are back to finish our series on the Apollo 1 disaster. Also returning, like you heard, is Kyle, a space industry engineer working at a launch vehicle company. Kyle, thank you so much for coming back on the show and subjecting yourself to this again, frankly.
Yeah, to be quite frank, thank you for coming back for round 2 of the pain.
All right, it's my turn to be frank. Thank you for coming back on the show.
I thought he was Chris. Now I'm confused.
Now it's Frank. We are all Frank Borman on this day. Also, he figures heavily into this story in weird and dumb ways.
Wait, what?
Our hero, he is here.
God bless. Or Frank bless.
Oh, man. Audience, for this one, not quite as much of a content warning as the last time. Like I said in the last episode, we are going to start off with a bit of a sanitized recap for people who skipped out on the more content warning-y stuff. This one's just going to make people mad, I figure.
With higher blood pressures, your discretion is advised.
I'm going to become a pressure washer with this episode. I'm going to...
Like, we just pop your head off like a cork, and you just spray your
I'm just going to, like, Yamato, just wave cannon motion my head into the stars. It's gone. R.I.P. homies.
A small seismic event will occur somewhere in an apartment in the continental United States.
Small might be a little bit. You know what? Yeah, I'm good with that.
Also, audience, if you enjoy our work and you want to either support us or get more of it, you can navigate your way to Patreon. Signing up at $3 a month will net you a monthly bonus episode, and signing up at any higher tiers will get you more bonus content and a call out at the end of the episodes. Also, as we get into this, for sourcing, I'm not going to be relying on the dumb pop history book this time. I held myself back. And I'm mostly going to be relying on the AS-204 disaster report, which was a kind of post-mortem investigation done by NASA into the Apollo 1 fire.
Are you talking about the same, author of the book that is trying to rehabilitate certain presidents?
I talked about that on the Lion server, and the discussion of the episode was significantly shorter than a huge discussion that got kicked off of people looking at this author, just wondering, like, why would you defend that one president so hard?
I honestly want to join the server just for that sole purpose. When we're done here, can you just send me an invite or something? I want to see it.
I think it's a Patreon thing, but you can just like send $1 and then leave.
Oh, yeah. And
then just hang around. But like, it's kind of a Streisand effect because I had not read up on it. And it made me want to go look. The fact that this weird man was unreasonably in favor. I think it was Harding.
Yes, in favor of Warren G. Harding.
Yeah.
I don't know very much about Warren G. Harding, and frankly, I never felt a need to, but I've certainly learned a whole bunch about opinions.
I can see him now if he were like, I don't know, like 30, 40 years younger, he'd be on YouTube with a rant Sona talking about Warren G. Harding.
Oh, yeah. Furry rant Sona, Warren G. Harding.
Some inflated title like a treatise in the defense of Warren G. Harding or something, and he'll talk at length for 2.5 hours.
He is firmly in alt-right sphere of YouTube. Just nestled in gently.
You could be kind of like an IDW kind of guy. I guess that is, nowadays pretty much the same thing, but
Showing up on the Joe Rogan Experience to talk about Warren G. Harding.
Everyone's favorite misunderstood, misrepresented president.
That's crazy, man.
Just pull up why he's misunderstood. God damn.
Wild.
Welcome, listeners, to Failure to Launch, a space history podcast where we talk about weird guys who talk about Warren G. Harding.
The Warren G. Harding true crime podcast.
I would just make like pop history postmortem. All right, I'm putting that on the list. Every episode, we just find a new pop historian. We reveal how incredibly little qualifications they have. We find all of their weird, dumb opinions, and we just put it on blast.
That's a pivot.
Ideally with another historian present.
That's certainly a pivot for us to take.
No, I have an even better pivot. We're just going to try to rehabilitate obscure politicians like, who is it? The one...
In the defense of Calvin Coolidge.
Yeah, Calvin Coolidge. But, God, I don't know why I have this random memory of some random Canadian PM that was just incredibly defensive of Canadian fishing waters.
I'm actually blanking on that. I don't know prime ministers as well as I should.
Dear listener, for some context, it took us an hour after the last episode of Chatter to fully decompress from how grim it was. So you may wonder why we're talking about presidents. Well, you're not going to get a whole lot of other satisfaction out of this one.
Yeah.
You gotta take the bits when they come.
We should let them get into it.
I always see people complain about like other shows. Why are they chattering? Why aren't they just delivering the info? It's because this audience is like, this is to let you decompress. This is to let you hear humans talking instead of me just delivering like soul-crushing info to you.
It's how the parasocial relationship starts and fosters.
Yes. Now, where we last left off, it was late January 1967. After a long and tumultuous development process, a new Apollo command module named Spacecraft 12 was hoisted onto a Saturn 1B rocket in preparation for the first manned flight of the Apollo program. The mission would be simple: launch the spacecraft into low Earth orbit, test that it could keep humans alive in space, and the crew was basically free to stay up there as long as they liked. The crew selected for the first Apollo mission was about as diverse as you could get with Right Stuff era astronauts, covering all three of NASA's astronaut selection groups at the time. Commander Gus Grissom was a veteran of the Mercury 7, America's first astronauts, and the second human to fly into space twice. I believe last time I said he was the first to fly into space twice, I forgot about an X-15 pilot. Apollo 1, this mission would push that record to 3. Before NASA, he flew fighters in the Korean War, served as a flight instructor, then joined the U.S. Air Force test pilot program. Senior pilot Ed White was from the New 9, NASA's second astronaut group. He was the first American to perform a spacewalk and had previously served as a pilot and test pilot in the U.S. Air Force. Apollo 1 would be his second time in orbit. Finally, pilot Roger Chaffee was the new guy of the crew and drawn from the 14, NASA's newest astronaut group. Before NASA, he flew U.S. Navy reconnaissance jets over Cuba during the missile crisis. Apollo 1 would be his first mission. Now, Apollo 1 was planned to fly in late February. When the disaster happened a month earlier, it was during a plugs-out test, basically a dress rehearsal of a launch with an unfueled rocket. After several hours of waiting on the launch pad while ground crews tried to fix problems with the capsule's life support, then the communication system, then the life support again, a fire started in the Apollo 1 capsule. Fed by the pure oxygen atmosphere and plenty of flammable netting strung around the capsule, it quickly became an inferno. The last garbled transmissions from the crew indicated that they knew about the fire and were trying to open the main hatch. However, to save development time and costs, Spacecraft 12 was what was known as a Block 1 Apollo command module. Instead of having the quick-release single hatch of the later Apollo missions, it had a complicated series of 3 hatches that had to be opened one at a time, taking at best 90 seconds. While the crew inside and launch staff outside tried to open the capsule, the pressure spiked so much that it burst the pressure vessel, filling the launch tower with caustic, corrosive smoke. From all available evidence, the astronauts were rendered unconscious inside of 30 seconds, most likely from the fire melting their air hoses and asphyxiating them. Still, dozens of launch personnel, with and without gas masks, fought through the smoke to fight the fire. While the rocket was unfueled, its launch escape rockets weren't, and if the fire set them off, the explosion would destroy the tower and kill everyone in it. Now, in the end, the burst pressure vessel actually worked to kill the fire pretty quickly. Basically, as soon as it burst, all of the pure oxygen was drawn out, and that kind of snuffed out the fire inside. But the smoke, heat, and hatch design meant that it would be more than 5 minutes before rescuers could unseal the hatch, long after the astronauts had died. While other American astronauts had died in training accidents or plane crashes, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee became the first to die in their spacecraft. So again, yeah, that's a little long for a recap, but I wanted to give as much information as possible for people who had skipped out on last time's a little bit more detailed.
I am glad we covered that the actual staff of the launch pad noticed the issue and immediately started fighting it.
Yeah.
To a great degree.
And like we talked about last time, I don't want to detract from the astronauts and their being the central figures of this disaster.
They performed their roles as they should, because weren't their bodies found in a position that would indicate that they were following their training?
Absolutely. Basically, Gus Grissom and Ed White were working to open the hatch as they should. Roger Chaffee was still in his seat because it was his job to maintain communications with the ground or with mission control.
So they were basically following the textbook the entire time, just to cement that.
Yeah. Same with the ground crew who, again, they fought their way through the fire, both two. And in doing so, it's because the fire kind of snuffed itself out. It's not likely that it actually would have been able to set off the launch escape tower, but they did not know that. And they put themselves in harm's way. A bunch of them had to get hospitalized for caustic burns and lung damage to try and save these astronauts and prevent a much bigger explosion.
It's pretty typical today for fire response to be basically, do not attempt to fight the fire. You're not equipped for it. Just get out. You can't hand it to these guys enough for recognizing that, there was a problem, but there were people in danger and doing their damnedest to do something about it.
I'm not going to say it's unfortunate because I do think in a lot of cases the get the fuck out approach is the proper one, especially whenever you're considering that, lives lost. They may not have attempted to save the astronauts if they'd fled, but the risk is that you could lose significantly more people, especially around a rocket, which has a tendency to explode sometimes. And I think a lot of it, Apollo 1 is why a lot of those regulations may have gotten written in the first place. But we will be getting into that in a little bit.
The investigation.
Now, the first step for NASA in responding to this disaster was to organize an investigation. Normally, this would be handled by a third party, someone without conflicts of interest who could be trusted not to hide anything. Not so here. On January 27th, the same day as the fire, and I'll also note that the fire happened at 11:30 p.m., so this was done within 30 minutes of the fire, NASA Administrator James Webb, the guy the telescope is named after, asked President LBJ that NASA and North American be allowed to investigate themselves, basically pinky promising that they wouldn't lie. And this worked. LBJ allowed NASA to be the ones to investigate this disaster.
Oh, come the fuck on.
Yep.
Within 30 minutes.
We investigated ourselves and found no fault or wrongdoing.
No. We're not even getting into that. We're getting into the fact that this is before the era of widespread, email of, hey, I called him. I held my fingers crossed behind my back that we're going to do this completely above board. And he just bought it. And chill out, brother. And we just...
This is kind of a weird situation because NASA actually did not lie. This investigation actually goes as planned. It does not sugarcoat things. However, that does not change the fact that an organization, on principle, even if they do a good job, should not be allowed to investigate themselves. An exception does not change that.
Yeah, the concept of impartiality, especially at this grand scale, is something that should be honored, but flagrantly wasn't.
Yeah, you're not going to get yourself out of the investigation because you're the expert in the system, but somebody else has to be asking the hard questions.
Oh, yeah. You need people from NASA and North American involved because they are the subject matter experts. You can't just bring in complete nobodies who don't know rockets.
But then you grill them front to back, left to right.
Yeah, at least the chairman of the investigation should probably not be a NASA guy. The day after the fire, the investigatory board was convened, and there were immediately some shakeups. Dr. Frank Long, a Cornell professor, left the board after a few days and was replaced by Robert Van Dola from the Bureau of Mines. I don't know what relevance or expertise he had.
Wait, landmines?
No, mines, digging.
The opposite direction and then a rocket.
This is the one time for an episode that I think it would be kind of funny to have real-time blood pressure tracking.
I'm actually curious about this guy for the other reason, for the opposite reason, which is part of my system safety elective I took in college. We studied a lot of mine disasters. The U.S. has had a lot of mine disasters. So if you're going to have a big industrial fire and accident, you might actually want a guy from the Bureau of Mines to come in and help head that investigation.
That is actually very fair. I hadn't thought of that because it's absolutely right. Like, the mechanism of these men dying was being trapped in a confined space with a fire. At the end of the day, it being on top of a rocket was not super relevant to what happened because the rocket was unfueled. It was basically just a metal tube. So I guess in that case, yeah, like a good idea to have that guy on. Meanwhile, George Jeffs, North America's chief Apollo engineer, he resigned the next day. Probably someone you would want to have stay on. From then on, the board was static, with 7 of the 9 board members being NASA officials and employees. Our boy Frank Borman was also on the board, and he was the lone astronaut represented.
Yeah, at least we got Frank.
Like, once this investigation it gets going, for all I've gotten mad and will get mad later in this script at North American and NASA for their seeming inability to know what quality control is, I need to hand it to them. This investigation is done well, and it is done to industry best practices. And personally, I don't know if that actually makes it better, because it shows that they weren't unable to do quality stuff. They didn't do it before, and they are turning on the ability to do that. It's kind of more damning.
I've rarely seen a disaster caused by someone just being unable.
Yeah.
Always poor decisions and complacency that, yeah.
And once they get the kick in the ass, they come back around to the stuff they always knew. They just, got lazy, complacent, negligent.
All was just ignored through other means.
Yes, exactly. I shouldn't put it all down to negligence and complacency whenever a lot of people did fight this very hard. But yeah, the first step was to inspect the interior. Quoting from the NASA report, after the couches were removed, a special false floor with removable 18-inch transparent squares was suspended from the existing couch strut fittings to provide access to the entire inside of the command module without disturbing evidence. So they take the couches out, they put this see-through floor, and guys are able to kind of crawl around in there and do little bits of work in this incredibly cramped space without disturbing the rest of it. Meanwhile, North American shipped another command module, Spacecraft 14, to Cape Canaveral, both to compare against Spacecraft 12 and to act as a dummy for figuring out the best way to disassemble the capsule. This is not something they had ever planned for. They needed a trial run. Starting a few days after the fire, crews of NASA technicians and engineers worked on a 3-shift, 7-day-a-week schedule to tear down Spacecraft 12 bolt by bolt. Because of how cramped the capsule was, only 2 men could be in there at a time, and they would spend hours basically in a low crouch, painstakingly removing every bolt and component from the interior and passing them out of the hatch. Every time a part was removed, they took a picture of the exposed area. By the time Spacecraft 12 was completely disassembled 2 months later, they'd taken over 5,000 photos. So if you've ever seen that picture of the Columbia shuttle parts that were recovered after the crash, and they're all laid out in a kind of like a stereotypical police scene silhouette, they basically did this for Apollo 1. And the goal of all of this was to inspect every single part, both for fire damage to see, is this the cause of the fire? And I don't know, maybe if a part is only burned on one side, that shows the direction that the flame traveled, and you can kind of forensics your way back to what caused the fire.
You also get a really good chance to go through all your quality control again.
Oh,
take it apart and
hold that thought.
Oh no.
For 1 second. For about 5 seconds, actually. Now, while they were looking for the direct cause of the fire, NASA staff found a lot of other issues. Quote, the Teflon covering on the wire used in Apollo 204 could be damaged easily or penetrated by abrasion. The covering could also be damaged when forced against the structure by poor installation. The board found numerous examples in the wiring of poor installation, design, and workmanship. An example is shown in Enclosure 27, where a wrench socket was found in the spacecraft.
Oh, we got FOD making an appearance.
Damn it. Fucking
internal FOD.
Fucking Teflon wire.
No, we have Teflon wire and FOD.
I can't believe you made me hold a thought on that since last episode.
I want you to mentally just rotate the socket in your mind and just, this is FOD now for every moment going forwards.
Question for the expert here, because I read up a little bit on it for this episode. You seemed to have a visceral reaction both to the socket and to the fact that Teflon was used. Teflon being pretty good at resisting fire, but also easy to damage. Is that something that like the industry has well moved past?
No, I have had abrasion issues with Teflon coated wire.
Oh, okay.
It was something that we knew to look for and caught, so it never made it anywhere near a spacecraft. But like, yeah, I've seen handling that wouldn't, like your average wire you'd buy at Home Depot. You know, you can drag it around, you can throw it on your driveway, you know, Romex or something similar to that. It's going to be reasonably fine. It's generally pretty durable. Takes a bit of a beating. Teflon, you got to be really gentle with. It scrapes, it scratches, you know, kind of like, I mean, exactly like a nonstick pan, honestly. Use a metal spatula in a nonstick pan and see exactly how bad your pan gets in a hurry, except it's also the insulation for your wires that are stopping a fire from starting.
Yeah.
As for the wrench sockets too, I've seen that happen. I've seen more than one instance at more than one company of wrench sockets getting sealed in places they should not have been, or being barely found during a post-test checkout as well, that shouldn't be there. What the hell?
Same thing.
It's important to inventory your tools before and after.
Shadow boards.
That is the correct method. Get all your tools. You have a shadow box of tools. Every time a shift changes, every single tool needs to be back in that box. And if anything is missing, you stop and you go and hunt down where the heck it went.
Yeah, FOD frenzies are annoying, but they are important for a reason. Do you guys want to hear something else fun? There were more problems.
Oh, Lord.
For example, the life support system, the one we talked about last time that smelled like sour milk and blinded astronauts, it was also found to be leaking glycol coolant onto the floor of the spacecraft.
Oh, the thing that's super slippery.
Well, thankfully, you know, it's just going to drain down below and stay there in the drain, and nothing would ever happen that would cause that to leave the floor on a spacecraft.
Everything below the astronaut's couch, that is the bilge of the spacecraft, so it can pool in there all it
Gravity
wants.
will always pull things down into that.
They might have a rat in there that chewed on cabling too. We don't know.
That just suck down glycol like a menace.
Isn't glycol like toxic to your kidneys?
Uh-huh. There are also other bad things that it does, like burn.
So you got the spacecraft that leaks, the spacecraft that blinds you, and the spacecraft that gives you kidney failure.
And all of that kind of makes it seem like the fact that it is also the spacecraft that kills you in 15 seconds is a good thing.
It is a spacecraft that is just inherently designed to incapacitate you.
Yeah, if it's the spacecraft that blinds me, gives me lung cancer, and gives me asbestos poisoning, it better kill me instantly.
It's like a roundhouse combo to your central nervous system. Good luck.
Also, going over North American's design documents, NASA engineers were horrified to find out that they had packed the capsule with more than 34 square feet of very flammable Velcro.
Can you repeat that number to me again? I'm trying to just
34 square feet.
Okay, I have a mental image of just the bonfire that creates. Thank you.
Yeah, you could make a blanket out of that.
Tuck me in. Let me go to sleep.
Tuck me into the burning Snuggie. So, and in investigating in this initial kind of teardown period, they were also, like, by looking at the fire damage on different parts, they were able to narrow the ignition point down to the left side of the capsule, immediately under astronaut Gus Grissom's couch. Now, in the end, NASA was not able to conclusively determine what the cause of the fire was. Part of that is because of the damage to the internals and the deaths of the only witnesses, but a lot of that is actually just because of how many candidates there were. Bad wiring, as we've talked about, was the leading theory. If a wire got damaged, say by North American engineers stomping on it, it could spark. Another option was a malfunction in some of the equipment, something that Apollo 1 knew all too well. They also looked at the life support's coolant leak, because the coolant was a mix of water and ethylene glycol, and while it itself didn't burn too good, if it leaked and the water evaporated, it left behind a sheen of ethylene glycol, which burns really good. So basically, by allowing this leak, the entire bottom of the spacecraft was varnished.
They just allowed it to form a beautiful flammable gel.
Yes.
So they turned this entire thing into one of those hotel burners for food.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
A little warming candle things.
A chafing dish, I think they're technically called. Or chafing.
Yeah, like the
that.
big scrambled eggs bins.
No, the actual like little pot of flammable jelly is a chafing burner.
So those were all options. While NASA was not able to 100% nail it down, in fairness, they did land pretty hard on the wiring issue. And again, this is about the cause of the fire. Even if the coolant leak didn't ignite the fire, we do know for a fact that it allowed it to spread.
It was a supporting factor, not a causative factor.
Exactly. It's like saying the Velcro did not start the fire, but it definitely helped. But regardless of the exact cause, and arguably more important, NASA was able to identify the conditions that made the disaster possible and likely. Quote,
Number 1, a sealed cabin, pressurized with an oxygen atmosphere. Number 2, an extensive distribution of combustible materials in the cabin.
Number 3, vulnerable wiring carrying spacecraft power. Number 4, vulnerable plumbing carrying a combustible and corrosive coolant.
Number 5, inadequate provisions for the crew to escape. And number 6, inadequate provisions for rescue or medical assistance.
So that is something, those last two specifically I want to call out because this report laid out kind of what everyone already knew, but now it is in a official and legal document. There is no way the crew could have escaped. They were rendered unconscious long before even like the best case scenario 90 seconds could have happened. Furthermore, it was discovered that while a lot of the ground crew did try and help, they did try and rescue them, there were not firefighters on hand, there were not dedicated rescue staff, and there were not doctors on hand. All of those people had to rush there, like they were in Cape Canaveral. They did have a fire service, but they were not nearby. In the moment, the additional help in this case probably would not have helped, but it's still a big failing.
It's near to the concept of a scenario where a guy gets shot in the head and falls onto a surgical table. What can you do for him there? Realistically, nothing. The problem has happened. There's nothing that you can help.
But there are also, in space history, a bunch of examples where people get hurt on the launch pad, and because of prompt medical attention, they don't die.
But for this scenario specifically.
Specifically, yes. But it's more of like a general failing. The investigation also wrote up a list of recommendations for future Apollo spacecraft. Some of them, especially those involving the hatch, weren't as useful because these were already part of the upgraded Block 2 design. This is why you'll see a lot of stuff about Apollo 1 that mentions, even some astronauts have made some kind of noises in this direction, that it is because of the deaths of the Apollo 1 astronaut that the astronauts that the rest of the program is able to succeed. They treat it kind of the way, I don't know why this is coming up in my mind, but like in Canada, the Dieppe raid in World War II is often treated as like, well, D-Day wouldn't have happened if we hadn't done this disastrous raid. And I don't know, I don't necessarily buy it. I am no expert, but the fact that a lot of these problems in the Block 1 spacecraft were already solved in the Block 2 does not convince me that this, needed to happen or that this was a good thing in the long run.
Like they were known but not rolled out.
I don't think you can possibly know one way or another, but it's not really ever the technical reasons that would have stopped them. It's the taking the entire program and making everybody go, stop, hold on, what the hell are we doing here?
Yeah.
That's what forces you to make the change
The
and
theoretical,
make sure you don't make the next set of stupid mistakes.
Especially because a lot of the failures in Apollo 1 and Spacecraft 12 were not necessarily design failures. Like you said, Teflon wires are still used in spacecraft. They are not necessarily the wrong choice. But it's those organizational, it's those quality issues that cause them to be problems. The hatch is definitely a design issue, but that has already been, even at this point, they know it is not perfect and they have a better one for Block 2. Now, at the same time, some of these recommendations did actually make it to the lunar missions. For example, the astronauts' spacesuits were remade with flame retardant material instead of nylon. Wires and pipes were covered in extra insulation.
I'm sorry, they made the spacesuits out of nylon?
Uh-huh.
That's insane.
That was actually what Gemini astronauts wore the whole way through.
What?
So the Apollo 1 astronauts were wearing old Gemini suits, and all Gemini missions, like 1 through 12, were using nylon spacesuits.
These guys were tooling around Cape Canaveral in like $1 a month, like leased Chevrolet Corvettes, and you're telling me none of them looked at like the racing community and went, "Hey, maybe we ought to do more than like a synthetic shirt."
No.
And nylon doesn't burn great, but when it is exposed to fire, it like melts onto the skin and just causes horrific burns.
Yeah, there's a reason I don't wear synthetics when dealing with arc flashes, because I'd like my shirt to come off when I get to the hospital.
The shirt is typically an ablative thing. It doesn't fuse.
Very much so, yes.
Another thing that was changed was that the spacecraft was redesigned to have an oxygen-nitrogen mix at launch instead of pure oxygen. Like the plan was, and this actually happened for all of the Apollo launches, whenever it made it up to orbit, it would vent the nitrogen and go back to pure oxygen. In reading more about this, I need to be fair, it was a technological limit at the time. Like they did not have the hardware and the sensors and the software to be able to make a system that could like mix the different atmospheres, mix the different gases in order to maintain air, for example. So the pure oxygen at launch was changed, but they couldn't really fix the pure oxygen in orbit without having to bring along a tank of like every single gas that makes up air.
You might as well decrease your risks on the ground where you're going to be spending a lot of time anyway.
Yeah.
From extremely flammable to just, regular flammable with mitigations. And I can imagine, why they're having issues, because when you're in a zero-G environment, your gases aren't going to mix super well unless you have forced ventilation. But if you don't have the sensors and computer system to measure your gas concentration at multiple points, or if they're not small enough to cram into your capsule, you can't get your mix right, and your system ends up adding too much nitrogen, and now everyone's oxygen deprived. A lot of bad things can happen. Sometimes, breathing has to take priority.
That is actually one of my favorite things I learned about space stations is that because, air circulation doesn't really work naturally, there's no wind. If the ventilation fails, an astronaut can just wake up in a bubble of CO2 with an intense headache. Thankfully, it hasn't yet to kill people on the ISS.
You just get submerged in the stupid gas for a couple hours.
So yeah, those were all the recommendations of the investigation. And the investigation then ended with one recommendation that couldn't exactly be seen in hardware or software. Quote, "Every effort must be made to ensure maximum clarification and understanding of the responsibilities of all the organizations involved, the objective being a fully coordinated and efficient program." And that's kind of like, again, that is the literal end of these recommendations of this report. This is like their main point. All of the design stuff aside, just talk to each other.
That is the hardest possible thing to do. Your materials are predictable, Nylon will burn, fire retardant materials won't. Don't abuse your Teflon coating, and it'll be fine. Your managers and your engineers on a schedule and your technicians just desperately trying to hit their end of shift goals, those are not predictable systems.
Yeah. Every system, no matter what, will have inherent risk. And it is what the people do working on it that decides whether that risk is minimized or maximized. And in this case, it was maximized the fuck out of. Now, another thing I want to talk about briefly is that, kind of owing to this investigation, whenever people talk about Apollo 1, and I was especially one of those people, they often view it as the American equivalent to Soviet cosmonaut Valentin Bondarenko's death in an oxygen fire. It makes sense. Training accident, oxygen fire, death of astronauts and cosmonauts. And we've talked about how Chaffee's father and Bondarenko's wife struck up a friendship over their shared loss. But I think in order to understand this better, it is much more appropriate to look at Apollo 1 as the American Soyuz 1, the mission that killed Vladimir Komarov. Because both were not just simple accidents. Both were the first manned tests of deeply flawed spacecraft with issues that were allowed to persist through negligence, poor communications, and rushed developments. Both Apollo 1 and Soyuz 1 had dozens of failures, some of them minor, and some of them combining to become lethal. For example, there wouldn't have been an oxygen fire on Apollo 1 if the wiring wasn't fucked. The crew would have been able to escape if the hatch wasn't fucked, and so on and so forth.
Just far deep into Swiss cheese theory at that point. Just everything lined up to make a singular horrific show.
Except in this case, NASA and North American kind of, through negligence, allowed this Swiss cheese, like they just took a drill and put a straight hole through the Swiss cheese.
Yeah, they made the hole themselves, and either way, you have horrific consequences.
And not to detract from either, Bondarenko's death, while tragic, I think it was more of just a freak accident. It was not in a spacecraft. It was not related to any design decisions.
The conswap managing to hit a hot plate as opposed to Soyuz.
As an engineer, I'm going to disagree with you.
Okay.
Not to be the guest that gets in arguments on your podcast, but
this is content, not arguments. Come on.
For any robust system, you need to take into account the actions of your operators involved. And so when you talk about Bondarenko's death and, discarding a cotton ball into a burner, yeah, okay, that's probably not the smartest thing in the world to do. But when you put people under pressure, or they're having a rough day, or they just slip and drop something, because people will always make mistakes, and you have to count on people making mistakes. If your system is such that a single mistake, a single operator's missed input, a single operator's action can cause lethal or catastrophic failure and that level of consequences, your system is a bad system. And if you as an engineer allow that system to go through, you are failing to do your job as an engineer to protect the people relying on your system. And if you as an engineer are forced by management to put that through, management also bears the liability for that system failure. So I don't actually agree that that's a freak accident. That is a fundamental failure of imagination and a failure of a program to provide a robust and safe system.
I think that's fair. If I can retract the freak accident part. For example, with Bondarenko, in fairness, looking back, there were design issues as well. Like the hatch of this room could not be opened until the pressure equalized, which is something that took several minutes. I do agree that there's definitely organizational, structural, and design flaws that led to Bondarenko's death. With this push, what I'm going at more is that I think Apollo 1, if compared to anything, if compared to any other similar disaster in space history, I believe it is closer to Soyuz 1 than Bondarenko.
Mm-hmm.
And I shouldn't have said that Bondarenko's death was just a freak accident, because that puts it into the category of just shit happens.
Yeah, what could we possibly have done differently?
Yeah, and if the disaster has things that could possibly have been done different, then yeah, it ain't a freak accident.
As an engineer, that was the number one takeaway in my safety and ethics class, was to basically just challenge everybody to look deeper into every system and every accident and really find, what could you have done differently, or in a different environment, what would have been developed differently. And it's an eye-opening way to look at things, to just hear that extra few levels deeper and just really dig down until you find where the actual base problem lies.
I gotta have you review my scripts for whenever I get hyperbolic. I like to think that my actual engineering work maintains that standard, but sometimes whenever I'm writing, things can kind of a flourish can make its way in that probably shouldn't in what I hope is a decently historical retelling.
Fallout and the Phillips report.
Now, after autopsies confirmed the cause of death, all three astronauts were given state funerals with full honors. Gus Grissom and Roger Chaffee were both buried in Arlington National Cemetery near Washington, their funerals attended by military leaders, politicians, and President LBJ. Ed White, meanwhile, was buried at West Point as per his wishes, though he almost wasn't. There was apparently a lot of organizational pressure on his wife Pat to let him be buried with Gus and Roger in Arlington, keeping the whole crew together, really ratcheting up the symbolism. Thankfully, Frank Borman got wind of this and shut it down. So good guy Frank again. Also, I do kind of appreciate just going to the grieving wife of an astronaut, of a national hero, and going the collection, the threefer, come on.
Wouldn't it be nice to have something for this holiday?
Stop.
Man, wouldn't it be nice if we could politicize this and make it look as good as we can on the TV against your late husband's funerary wishes?
There's just going to be a gap between Gus and Roger's stones. Come on, like it's not going to look right.
Listen, Broad, he wanted West Point, but we want him at Arlington.
Leave the gap.
Yeah, and then Frank just busts through like the fucking Kool-Aid man. Tiny little Frank Borman.
They call him small to his face.
No, I've seen either he's very small or his sons are massive, because we've all seen the picture where his two sons are holding him up. They're holding both of his arms, and he looks like what like you would do with a toddler. Like his feet are kind of dangling in the air.
Shut up.
I mean, he's lower to the ground, so like his fulcrum point is like smaller.
And as we've talked about, Gus Grissom also very tiny. Yuri Gagarin extremely tiny. Tiny people are, at the end of the day, kind of just better for space. If you're looking at it in purely like oxygen, like launching small women is kind of the perfect thing for space as far as resources consumed, volume consumed, weight, all of that. Now, as for the families, the Chaffees we've somewhat talked about. Roger's dad, Don Chaffee, whose career as a barnstorming stunt pilot got Roger interested in aerospace in the first place. Also, I need to mention that he was a qualified aerospace QA tester.
That's just knife in the ribs at that point.
So he wrote a book about his son's life in the Apollo 1 disaster named On Course to the Stars. I'd highly recommend it. We also covered it in the Bondarenko episode in the last episode, but when the Soviet space program opened up about the disappeared cosmonauts, Don struck up a friendship with Valentin Bondarenko's wife, bonding over the death of their loved ones and the sacrifices they'd made for space exploration. The White family, their story is a little less rosy. Ed's wife, Pat, fell into a deep depression she never recovered from. She took her life in 1983. Meanwhile, Ed's younger brother James decided he was going to follow in Ed's footsteps and become an astronaut. He joined the Air Force, became a fighter pilot, and because he thought it would be a good resume stuffer and a stepping stone to test pilot and then astronaut, he volunteered to fly in Vietnam, where he died in a plane crash in 1969. Also, his remains were only recovered in 2018, 6 years ago, and brought back to the States to be buried. Finally, Gus's family, the Grissoms, is an interesting, sad, and particularly infuriating story that I'm going to save for the end. Now, like any big disaster in a huge public space program, Apollo 1 set off a political firestorm. And while normally I tend to think of these as politicians jockeying to be the loudest in the room, in this case NASA and North American deserved all of it. As NASA was nailing down the basic details of the accident and the massive negligence that it allowed to happen, politicians and the public wanted to know how and why. Committees were formed, more investigations launched, and the members of the NASA Investigation Board were brought in bit by bit to explain themselves. You can find a lot of this online, publicly available. And because nothing is ever black and white, there's still plenty of politicians being short-sighted and stupid. Frank Borman, for example, was called to testify before Congress and the Senate. In front of Congress, he got into a long debate with a Congressman John Widler, about the design of the new hatch. Widler argued that redesigning it was pointless because even if the hatch could open in less than 2 seconds, the astronauts would probably already be dead. Borman responded, quote,
"If they had had a hatch that opened outward and opened in 2 seconds, there's no question in my mind that they would have escaped."
Well, I'm glad to see that Congress people getting things wrong about space and engineering hasn't changed. My God.
Getting anything right is usually a celebration.
There's not enough guillotines in this century.
Sometimes you just gotta let astronauts just punch people, you know?
Oh, the Aldrin approach.
Yeah, just let Frank Borman punch a senator.
Let Frank Borman guillotine a senator.
He probably punched the guy who suggested that Pat White bury Ed in fucking Arlington. So
Good.
I fucking hope so.
Set him loose. Now, that's us doing our thing and fanboying over Frank, the favorite pastime of this show, but things did not go that well overall. Senator Walter Mondale, who was later the VP under Carter, questioned NASA Administrator James Webb. Again, the guy the telescope is named after. Yeah, exactly. Specifically, he asked him if he'd ever heard of a report that had circulated around NASA in the years before the disaster, one that laid out quality issues, design shortcuts, and basically everything we talked about last time that was wrong with Spacecraft 12. Webb responded that he'd never heard of it. The guy sitting next to him, Major General Samuel Phillips, the director of the Apollo program, also hadn't heard of it. This was a huge lie. Both of these men had heard of the report because Phillips wrote it.
Wait, hold on.
This is the Phillips report.
Oh, God. Oh, Jesus.
Is this your
Yes.
child? No, it is named the Phillips Report. Would you like to comment on that?
Phillips is a common name.
Must have been another.
Must have been like this says Major General Samuel Phillips, director of the Apollo program.
You got the wrong Major General Samuel Phillips.
Phillips, director of the Apollo program. That's the other guy.
It says you delivered it directly to James Webb. No, that's
a different
typo.
James Webb, administrator of NASA.
Should have said Wames Jeb. You wouldn't know him. He lives in Canada.
Just James Webb with a fake mustache.
James Webb, the actual telescope.
Oh, God.
So again, this is part of why I said people will come out of this not liking James Webb, because his response with this was to then try and like split hairs, and so actually it was a memo, not a report.
Pardon my language, but the text hit your desk, a motherfucker.
And then Mondale pointed out that in the Phillips report, it calls itself a report more than 10 times.
Incredible.
The report self-identifies as a report. Never mind, I don't identify the report as a report.
Didn't think I'd be cheering for Walter Mondale here.
Uh-huh.
All right, go get him, Walter.
No, this is absolutely a case of let them fight.
This kicked off a back and forth of press conferences, notices, and letters to the editor, as Webb and Phillips tried to dig themselves out of the hole of, we covered up major problems in a space program and committed perjury to do it. Needless to say, this did not endear NASA to the government, the media, or the public, and gave everyone the impression that NASA and North American were more interested in covering their own asses than actually saving astronaut lives. Mondale delivered the finisher, quote,
NASA's performance, the evasiveness, the lack of candor, the patronizing attitude exhibited towards Congress, the refusal to fully respond forthrightly to legitimate congressional inquiries, and the solicitous concern for corporate sensitivities at a time of national tragedy can only produce a loss of congressional and public confidence in NASA program. And neither NASA nor the nation can afford such a loss.
Like, the worst person you know just made a great point. The guy who famously hated
Bastard
NASA
stabs other
and tried to get...
bastard.
Yeah. A guy who is not well regarded in space history circles because of his not liking space exploration. Just this self-inflicted wound. We're going to go over this in more detail in a bit, but like NASA around this disaster manages the PR game horribly, like legendarily bad.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to hand it to Walter Mondale, but that was the correct line of inquiry, and that is a pretty darn solid conclusion given what he's dealing with.
You'd hope that whether someone likes or doesn't like NASA, they would respond the exact same way to James Webb and Samuel Phillips lying to them. Now, I want to take a minute to walk you through the Phillips report, which is now public not because NASA released it, but because Representative William Ryan managed to get a copy from a NASA insider. He got this copy and he told NASA, hey, I've got this copy. If you don't release it, I'm going to. NASA refused, so he just released it at a press conference.
God bless.
Which shows like the degree that NASA, even once the cover-up had been exposed, they were still just like being petulant about it. They didn't want to release it. Even though like they know it's going to get released one way or the other, they still dug their heels in and like had to be dragged kicking and screaming into this.
I can't believe that NASA is headed by children.
No.
I can't believe we're 2 for 3 on Congress when just hammering NASA.
So this report covers a review period from November 22nd to December 6th, 1965. In it, Samuel Phillips lays out in broad strokes all the problems he and a group of NASA engineers found in North American's design, build, and quality processes. It paints a picture of North American as sort of like the modern Boeing, a top-heavy, bloated organization that has all the money in the world for make-work administrative jobs, but cuts corners on engineering.
Oh, it's time to get mad. Even more so. Sweet.
More than a year before the fire, and I shouldn't say, I mean, Boeing, Bombardier especially, companies that kind of get like, we talked about this last time, the dichotomy between cowboy shit and having a lot of structure and managers and whatnot. And I don't think North American being the way it is necessarily said like, oh, cowboy shit is the way to go. It's just that North American has taken over bureaucratizing and made it like an art form. They are ridiculously top-heavy. More than a year before the fire, the command module and Saturn V's second stage were far behind schedule and over budget. Phillips found that there were no effective communications for engineers and technicians, which meant that both problems couldn't be flagged, and teams often wound up working over each other or in parallel, lowering efficiency. So because these teams aren't talking, they often wind up just doing the same task in like slightly different ways, and you wind up with two parallel products that are meant to do the same thing, and only one of them is supposed to exist.
Oh, good. Model of efficiency.
This is even better, though. In one particular bureaucratic headshot, Phillips found that North American project leads actually didn't have authority over half of the people working on their projects. Quoting the report, "We question the true strength and authority of each program manager and his real ability to be fully accountable for results when he directly controls less than 50% of the manpower effort going into his program."
What?
Yeah.
Wait, where are these engineers coming from?
I don't know.
Who's in charge of them?
You're the propulsion manager, and for some reason, a guy who, like, 50% of the people working on propulsion don't answer to you, and you have to talk to the navigation guy.
We got these guys running around with, like, just swinging wrenches and, like...
It's a fucking Montessori space program.
We have engineering Ronin just running around masterless making spacecraft.
There's just a gestalt of engineers.
Yeah, showing up the day of and just deciding, you know what, I'm feeling like today's a navigation kind of day.
No, this is a car that you can only control the acceleration in. Your hands, they are not allowed to touch the steering wheel. Wherever it goes, don't care. It's still your problem.
I want to get Art of Engineering Ronin. That is stuck in my head. Just masterless rocket scientists wandering the floors of the North American assembly line.
Just throwing a slide rule through someone else's head.
A slide rule folded 1,000 times with the perfect edge. It even has that like slight wave in it.
You know, it's 1,000 folded pocket protector and the pens inside of it.
Just stamping people's documents at random. Yep, ship it, send it to production.
Yeah, anytime you kill a fellow engineer, you inherit their stamp.
Yeah, taking on the daimios who are the project managers.
and their loyal retainers.
This is the dumbest thing on the planet. This is like the people in charge of a department don't run half of the department. Everyone is just...
Yeah, are we saying that at some point we could have the engineering Shinsengumi?
Oh, God.
Could we have a hotel incident between engineers?
Now, the Phillips report ended with a long list of strongly worded recommendations to North American's President Lee Atwood, which were only recommendations in the sense that he made it clear North American would have to clean up their own mess and NASA wouldn't do it for them. And as much as I rag on North American for bloated, ineffectual management, the report did touch on quality control issues, the things most relevant to Apollo 1. Quote, "NAA quality is not up to NASA standards. This is evidenced by the large number of correction engineering orders and manufacturing discrepancies. This deficiency is further compounded by the large number of discrepancies that escape NAA inspectors but are detected by NASA inspectors. NAA must take immediate and effective action to improve the quality of workmanship and to tighten their own inspection." To be clear, NAA here is North American Aerospace. So even whenever they bother to do QA, they don't do it good, and NASA winds up picking up a load of their problems.
So NASA in this report just flat out lit them up. Your quality control is garbo. We're still picking up all of your stuff. Fix it. Even though they accepted it in the end.
And again, I want to put this within context. Like, the Phillips report does a very good job, more than a year before the Apollo 1 disaster, of laying out, like, up until now, the impression has always been that, like, the astronauts knew about this, the engineers and technicians on the ground knew about this, they all tried to pass these issues up, and they got lost in the bureaucracy and the churn at the top levels. And the Phillips report proves that the top levels were well aware of these issues, and just didn't do anything about it. And then, whenever this report got found out, James Webb and Samuel Phillips tried to lie to Congress and the Senate to say that it had never happened. Because, like, I'm kind of going through the Phillips report, I'm on Samuel Phillips's side, and then I remember that it's like, oh yeah, you scumfuck.
Yeah, you were right until you picked up the Shaggy defense and just, oh, that it wasn't me.
Now, in the end, Congress kind of let NASA off the hook for this instead of raking them over the coals like I think they should have. Regardless of what they deserved, it was in everyone's best interest that NASA get back to work on winning the space race and try to do it a little bit safer this time, maybe.
Try not to kill as many astronauts, Can you pinky promise?
Swearsies. Mr. Webb, give me your pinky right now.
I'm really, really caught up on the fact that Phillips, the man who the report is named after and authored by, who put you up to that outside of you just being poo-brained in the moment to be like, oh no, I had nothing to do with this in front of a congressional committee. Like,
in complete fairness, the way it is presented is that the question was initially put to James Webb, and it was one of those kind of things where like you have the main person being questioned, and then behind them you have like people who can back them up, which is allowed because, not everyone has all the answers on them. You have people, different subject matter experts. James Webb threw it to Samuel Phillips, and in a panic, Phillips was like, never heard of it, and then immediately greeted with like, weird, because it has your name on it.
I think they should have been brought, both of them should have been brought in front of Congress and forced to chop off a pinky finger with a chisel.
Yeah, that is the only kind of pinky swearsies that I will approve of in this situation.
Hand the vice president your pinky fingers as a promise. You're probably going to have to bleep that out, but...
No, it'll be fine.
We've said more heinous things on this show.
Now, Mondale's committee agreed that the Phillips report did not directly call out the cause of the fire, and that in hiding it, James Webb had technically not been covering up that NASA knew about the impending disaster a year in advance. Instead, they gave Webb a slap on the wrist and expressed their disappointment that he'd lied to them.
How could you?
Administrator Webb, hold out your hand.
Where's the chisel?
And all of this is true, but it's only true in the sense that the Phillips report didn't literally call out the cause of the fire or say, I see wires getting stepped on. Technically correct, NASA had not covered up the cause of the Apollo 1 disaster. But what the report does make abundantly clear is that NASA's top brass were all well aware of the massive quality issues with North American products. And this also extends to the second stage of the Saturn V. Also, a lot of the rocket engines for the other stages, the first stage and the third stage, were also manufactured by North American. Personally, I think if they knew the scale of those issues, they'd have done the right thing and scrubbed the test. I don't want to accuse them of the same dumb conspiracies that surround Soyuz 1, for example. Like the Komarov had to go, Gus Grissom had to go because he knew if he didn't, his backups would have to go, so he went and he knew he was going to die. Like, I don't think that is what happened. But still, all of this showcases the rot that was allowed to fester. Everyone at every stage knew it. The engineers and technicians, the astronauts, and even the top brass, and there were efforts, real and token, at every one of these stages to fix these problems. They just didn't materialize. NASA delivered the report to North American and they demanded fixes. And then those fixes never happened and NASA never held them to it. They gave an ultimatum and then they allowed it to be crossed.
If there's no enforcement of the rules you have placed, for all intents and purposes, those rules don't exist.
Exactly. The Phillips report was delivered, so Lee Atwood was the president of North American. He got this report, and he got it delivered from Phillips. He got a whole bunch of flack from all of NASA saying, like, hey, fix this. And he said, absolutely, we're going to fix it. And then a year later, Gus Grissom hangs a lemon in front of the simulator, and then a couple of months after that, the fire happens. 5 days after that, the fire happens.
It's a classic case study in how management can absolutely kill a program. What are you going to do? You're a technician, you speak up about it. Well, you don't want to work on it, you're fired, you're out. Management's not going to back you up on that. You're an engineer, same deal, all the way up the line, because those at the top just aren't given enough of a fuck about making sure that it actually happens.
Yeah. Again, despite having this, Congress, I don't know if it was the right decision, but Congress made the decision that, wouldn't torpedo NASA as hard as they could have. In letting NASA off the hook for this, they also allowed NASA the best chance to continue their project and to continue working on the Apollo program. And as far as the ongoing program, there was political fallout from Apollo 1. There were delayed launches, but after the improvements were made to the Apollo Block 2, also the Apollo Block 1 never flew again. They basically decided that the next manned flight would have a Block 2. They would just wait for it, which is the right decision, and it makes you wonder why the first time through they were willing to test with a a cut rate, bad quality Block 1.
It's all about your schedule pressure.
But at the same time, especially because any test data, any conclusions you make from the Block 1 will probably not carry over to the Block 2 because for all intents and purposes, they are completely different spacecraft. They have so few parts in common. Cool, the Block 1 can keep people alive in orbit. That doesn't mean anything for the Block 2. There are very few conclusions you can safely draw from one to the other.
Oh hey, the Saturn 1B works. Great. Now we
Huzzah.
only have to develop an entirely another booster again. Excellent.
Crisis communications.
Now, I think the existence of the Phillips report and everyone's failure to act on it is pretty damning, but the whole debacle also highlights how poorly NASA handled the crisis communications around Apollo 1. For those not familiar with it, crisis communications is basically when an organization is facing some kind of crisis and wants to properly manage the info getting out to the stakeholders. For NASA, as a government organization, that means making the public, the taxpayers, aware of a lethal accident involving astronauts, but doing it in such a way to keep panic to a minimum and maintain public trust in NASA. If done properly, good crisis comms can actually improve your image, like what happened with Apollo 13. And for this section specifically, I'm going to be relying on Adding Fuel to the Fire by James Kaufman, writing in the Public Relations Journal. Kaufman lays out 3 things an organization facing a crisis like this should do. 1, respond quickly. 2, tell the truth. And 3, provide a constant flow of information. NASA did none of these. First, they waited 2 hours to announce that the fire had happened. And admittedly, part of this is because letting the family know, making sure they are not hounded. I don't see a perfect way around this, but regardless, the delay does contribute to bad crisis comms, even if it does wind up being the right ethical thing to do.
Yeah, about the most you can say is an incident has occurred, which satisfies nobody, but
Yeah.
kind of covers your base.
Hold that thought. When they finally did announce it, they said that there had only been 1 fatality. They then upgraded to a vague quote, "There has been fatality," which is either a typo that they announced. It's just, there has been fatality.
That is
Death
somehow
has occurred.
worse.
I know.
Who died? Did you just kill everyone in
Everyone
the
is
building?
dead. The entire facility has been engulfed in flame.
And that's another thing in crisis comms. Don't put out typos, for the love of God.
And whatever you do, don't put out anything wrong.
Yeah, and don't put out 2 wrong things back to back that directly contradict each other.
Mm-hmm.
While the media clamored to try and get information on the fire, different NASA officials were basically shoved into press conferences unprepared, and because they were unprepared, they gave a lot of different answers. There was no script. The spacecraft was running on external power, or it was on internal power. 1 person was killed, or 3, or dozens. Who knows?
So there was no unified front. There was just, hey,
Chris, like you were saying, the whole, everyone's dead, the whole space, Cape Canaveral is on fire. That's basically what someone said and was presented as truth.
Yeah, waiting 2 hours sounds bad, but this is when you really would rather just say an incident has occurred, we don't have more info for you yet.
Especially whenever those 2 hours gave them more than enough time to figure out what they were going to say. So they delayed, and then they still lied and gave wrong info. If there is any reason for delay, it is you say, like you said, right off the bat, there has been an incident. We will give you more info as soon as we have it and have it confirmed. That's the responsible thing to do. Instead, NASA says nothing for 2 hours and then says people have died, or they haven't, or they're all dead, or they're not.
An incident has occurred, and an indeterminate number of staff and crew are in a state of superposition of being both alive and dead. We don't know.
You don't want to give Schrodinger's press statement.
Can we go to Cape Canaveral and check? If you check, the superposition will collapse. Is that really what you want?
Do you want to be responsible for the deaths of these people?
As long as we don't tell you, they could be on a farm being happy. Do you really want to take that away from them? Now, some of this can be written off as unprepared nerds suddenly having to give press conferences to politicians when they themselves didn't have all of the answers. But NASA also lied deliberately. Quote, NASA reported that the astronauts died immediately while sitting in their seats and that they said nothing. Yet 4 days after the tragedy, the New York Times and the Washington Star published articles challenging both contentions. The paper stated that the astronauts lived for 15 seconds or more after the fire began. Moreover, they did not die in their seats as NASA had originally reported. 2 of the astronauts had left their seats and tried to exit the capsule. Finally, the newspapers pointed to the existence of audio tapes from the capsule that proved the astronauts had cried out for help. The space agency had no comment on the articles.
Oh, good. Now we're going to the no comment response.
Yeah, and we're also reaching the I mean, it's a nicer story, but in trying to make these deaths quick and painless and nice and fine and not bad, they also lied and censored and yeah, they get to the no comment stuff when called out on it.
You should have started with that one.
At the very least, going no comment is better than what happened before, because if James Webb had just said, "I do not recall," the fucking Phillips report bombshell would not have hit as hard. It's when NASA tries to respond to stuff and dig themselves out of the hole for their lies that they then get crushed. So they're learning to lie better. When NASA announced that only NASA was qualified enough to investigate the accident, the thing that James Webb convinced LBJ of, they were immediately attacked by journalists and politicians pointing out the very obvious conflict of interest. Now, like we talked about, the AS-204 report didn't sugarcoat things or cover up NASA's many failures. But a few hours after the fire, people didn't know that. And what they did know was that NASA was deliberately lying to them and now saying, "Trust us, we can investigate ourselves."
So they've already been proving to be, just BSing on a public forum, despite the fact that this official report exists. But everything they've done in the meantime has been shady.
Oh, you mean the Phillips report, not the AS-204 report, right? So in fairness, all of this is happening immediately after the fire. This is like an hour or two after the fire, while everyone is clamoring for answers like, "Hey, what happened?"
I think that Chris is referring to the Phillips memo, actually.
Oh, okay, yeah, not a report, legally and distinctly.
Easy to get those confused.
Yeah, if you're not a NASA administrator like me. I mean, at the end of the day, if there is one thing that I think most politicians can be called subject matter experts on, it's memos and reports. And all of this kind of shows crisis communications is very fickle, especially there's a big degree of timing. If you deliver the exact same info at different times, it will have incredibly different responses. If you say there has been an incident and there have been fatalities, if you say it right away, it's great content communications. If you say it an hour or two late, it is horrible crisis communications. If you wait, rumors start to form because people don't have answers, so they're going to fill in the spaces themselves. If you try and quash those rumors, they will only get emboldened because it will be seen as a cover-up.
If you say there were no fatalities and it turns out there was fatalities, you sound suspicious as hell.
Yeah.
If you say there were fatalities, you don't know how many, at least you're being honest. And if you're really lucky and there weren't fatalities, people don't care.
Yeah, even if it is a genuine mistake, as much as possible, people can try and assume idiocy over malice, however that expression goes. In crisis communications, the opposite is true. If you make an honest mistake, it will probably be interpreted as an attempt at a cover-up. It will be interpreted as malice because you're a fucking rocket scientist. What do you mean you don't know what happened? NASA has presented itself. It has built up this image over 8 years at this point. The preeminent organization to take humans to space, the people that will get Americans on the moon. And now they are being shady as shit. They're lying. And they don't even between different NASA people who are both lying, they are telling different lies. They can't even get their story straight on what they're trying to cover up. And what's even worse is that from what we know of the top brass of NASA, they thought this was going great and they didn't understand what all the hubbub was about.
Come
on. We got
some
disconnect here.
Basically, they were much more focused on protecting NASA's image than informing the public, and they didn't seem to understand that the best way to do one is to do the other. If you hide shit from the public, it hurts your image. You are a publicly funded organization. The best way for NASA to be cool and good is to tell the public shit. Robert Gilruth, the head of the Manned Spaceflight Center, said, quote,
"We've got to make people stop thinking about this fire."
Why are they thinking about it? Come on. What the fuck?
What could have possibly...
I'm sorry, it's been 2 days. Why are you still talking about this?
Well, he is a like government administrator in the 60s, trying to change people's minds was a big thing. Didn't work very well.
Yeah. I'm sure he was
Certainly
hoping
gonna
he could just change minds like the MK Ultra way. Haven't we got friends who can just like forcibly make people not think about this fire or anything ever?
We've mailed you a tab of acid. Please take it.
It's 1967. Are lobotomies really that far in the past?
MK Ultra's just making me think about the whole like the thing of like giving the test subject enough LSD to the point where he can ignite this goat with his mind.
Just lacing the like sandwich bar at the press conference so that all the journalists just lose their shit.
Now that would not have happened because James Webb banned any NASA PR people from talking to the media until the AS-204 report was released. It took 2 months for Spacecraft 12 to be torn apart. The investigations followed that. The report, I don't remember the exact day off the top of my head. It was several months before the report came out, and even then it was only released to Congress at first. So James Webb is betting on just like the idea of like, what if we just say nothing for half a year? Maybe that'll work.
Let's just hope they'll forget about it.
Yeah, it did not work. This caused so much flack that NASA relented and allowed one, I have in brackets here, one guy.
Confirmed, a singular journalist.
A singular journalist. So all the media had to agree, and they picked one guy, and that one guy was the representative of the media, capital M, who was allowed access to the capsule. Also, when James Webb testified to Congress, it came out that North American wasn't actually the recommended pick to develop the Apollo command module, but the experts were overruled by Webb because North American offered the lowest bid of the bunch. Martin Marietta was actually like the top pick by the experts.
Are any of us shocked at this? That they just...
I mean, no, at the end of the day...
You get what you pay for? ?
But Apollo was not the military, you know? Apollo was not going for the cheapest shit. I imagine they wanted good bang for their buck. Considering the budget they had, considering how huge of a priority Apollo was, I think they probably could have gone with the slightly pricier option that didn't involve working with North American.
The Martin Marietta crashes have the, North American air fryer.
And again, this is not like... I cannot stress enough, this is not something he gave up willingly. He was caught lying about it. Like the people who were investigating him managed to get this, again, through insiders, through back channels and whatnot. They knew whenever they were talking to him, it was a trap.
How many times has he been caught at this point? I need to know.
He's been caught lying to Congress twice. He has lied to the media repeatedly, and whenever he's not lying, he is trying to do like a full information crackdown.
So for all intents and purposes, he has functionally triple tapped any kind of credibility he has.
Yeah.
Also, to hit James Webb with one of my favorite things, if you think safety is expensive, try an accident, in response to him going for the fucking cheap shit design for his pod.
And in a real sense, the Apollo program obviously survives Apollo 1, and a lot of improvements do come out of it, but like the cost to the program, both in terms of like funds, time, PR, like the trust of the entire American public drops considerably after this.
Still thinking about what I just said, because like you think about...
But continuing.
I like to remind new engineers and interns that if your accident shuts down a program with hundreds of people working for a week, it's going to cost a hell of a lot more than whatever safety mitigation you had planned.
Yeah, that's what I was going to piggyback on what I had just said. Is just like, okay, so we
Mm-hmm.
You saved money buying the cheapo pod, great, but your cheapo pod just lit on fire. You have lost that. You lost the crew. Now you have loss of reputation from lying in the press conference. Like you have months of investigation work to do. Like that's man hours, that's labor costs.
And you have to wait for the Block 2 anyway. Now, I can talk in circles about why all of this is a bad idea, but I think Kaufman summarizes it best. Quote, NASA's crisis communications regarding the Apollo fire exacerbated the tragedy, hurt the agency's credibility, and tarnished its image. Specifically, NASA responded too slowly to the fire, angering the media and allowing rumors to circulate about NASA's possible culpability. It communicated inaccurate, contradictory, and purposefully misleading information. It lied to Congress and the media. It refused to release information to congressional investigators, creating the impression that NASA was trying to cover up questionable practices. And it appointed a committee that consisted mainly of NASA officials or people closely connected to NASA to investigate the fire, prompting criticism of NASA's openness and raising questions about the objectivity and value of the investigation. By the time NASA repaired the Apollo spacecraft and readied a new crew to fly, recalls astronaut Jim Lovell, NASA discovered that it, quote, had squandered most of the public relations capital it had accumulated over a decade.
Hope that the savings was worth it.
You've got dead astronauts, you've lost a lot of time, and you're having to wait for the Block 2 anyway. So
thankfully, no major aerospace corporation would ever have anything like this ever happen again.
No, God no. Certainly not the one that ate North American.
No, never.
Nope.
I do kind of wonder if it's like eating poison, if it just kind of like lingers in the organization. Because Boeing at this time had a much better quality control. Boeing worked on, I think, Boeing was stage 1 of the Saturn V.
Are you talking about the concept of bioaccumulation, but applied to a corporation?
Yes. As a small aerospace company has a little bit of bad stuff in it, and it gets eaten by a big aerospace, and eventually it just winds up at, like, the 2 big ones.
How much lead has bioaccumulated in the Boeing upper management?
One of my favorite things about the Soviet OKBs is that time that an entire factory from, I think, OKB 52 just switched sides. If an entire Boeing factory just went Ronin and decided to, either become their own company out of nowhere, like fly a new flag, or just defect to Airbus, that would be so cool.
Imagine that they just go Ronin and they just don't have a flag and they're just making stuff.
They're just making new planes.
They don't even know. They don't even know like where they're gonna go. Like they don't even know who they're selling them to. They just keep making planes.
They're just doing it for the love of the game. Now, because this show is this show, and because we have covered this whenever we've talked about other space failures, especially the lethal ones, we have to talk about conspiracies.
Apollo 1 conspiracies.
Now, I can't prove this, but I believe that a downstream symptom of NASA's failure to properly communicate with the public about the fire is the proliferation of dumb conspiracy theories. At a base level, it kind of makes sense. Why aren't they telling me about this thing? Why are they quiet? It must be because they know something and they don't want me to know it. That means it's bad. This is not new or unique to Apollo 1. Arguably, we've seen it play out much worse when the Soviets covered up and censored accidents involving cosmonauts. With either no answers or the official narrative being obviously false, people were left to fill in the blanks themselves. And most conspiracy theorists, unfortunately, are bad authors who write dumb stories. That's something I've always found so interesting about conspiracy theories is just like as stories, as narratives of things that happen, they are often like the most kindergarten level shit. Like they're not even engaging. I don't know. Maybe I'm just spoiled by reading history and learning that like history will always do the dumbest thing possible. But in the Soviet cases, most of the conspiracy theories were peddled by foreign watchers, people who knew the Soviets were hiding something. For Apollo 1, it's complicated because the main spreader of conspiracy theories is Gus Grissom's son, Scott. So this is what I talked about whenever I said that the Grissom family's story is weird and infuriating.
Oh yeah, that doesn't bode well.
Now, this is not to knock a man for having trouble dealing with the grief of losing a parent at a young age. I've lost a parent. It's not easy. But as we're going to get into, Scott is not just coping poorly with the death of his father, he is grifting off of Gus's death and the deaths of Ed White and Roger Chaffee. He has weaponized his own grief, and that of his mother, and implicated the White and Chaffee families as participants in a cover-up of NASA murdering his father as he sees it. So, as you can understand, I am not a big fan of Scott Grissom. If you check his IMDb, it's him in a moon landing hoax documentary in huge air quotes, and a flat earth documentary.
I don't have a big enough mouth or sharp enough teeth to bite him in half.
And in complete fairness, in both of those, he's not saying, like, I don't think we landed on the moon. I don't think the Earth is flat. But he's still willing to go. He's willing to go wherever will accept him and help him kind of push his chosen thing, which is NASA murdered my dad. So, and if he's gonna get some money, if he's gonna get some fame talking to moon landing hoax people, hell yeah.
You guys always have like the rational response. You always have something nice to say. You're like,
and you're just like
you
gnashing
soften it.
your
I'm
teeth.
like, I'm just like frothing the moment that you mention things.
Can we resurrect, Frank Borman to just cross counter this man into the floor?
I don't like Scott Grissom. I am not a fan of him. And his story goes a little like this. And for this, I am sourcing an interview he and Gus's wife, Betty, Scott's mom, did with a deeply disturbed photographer, journalist, huge air quotes there, named Mark Estabrook. In the interview, Scott also displays a profound lack of understanding of how the capsule worked. He doesn't seem to know about the Block 1, Block 2 distinction, and he incorrectly believes that Gus's lemon stunt was done to protest the capsule instead of the simulator. That might seem like splitting hairs. I think it's important because this is a guy who has like supposedly investigated this and figured out all of these. I believe he was a UPS pilot. He is well educated. He likes to present himself as having researched this and come to actual conclusions to back up his claims. And he doesn't know how the spacecraft worked. So yeah. And to recap, as I get into this is Scott's story of events. I'm going to say things as fact that he believes are fact. I don't believe this shit. So Gus's first mission was the Liberty Bell 7, a suborbital flight that made him the second American in space, though not in orbit. On landing in the ocean, there was a fault in the hatch, it blew too early, and Gus escaped as the capsule flooded and sank. There were some suspicions that Gus was to blame and had blown the hatch manually, but it was quickly proven that the fault was in the spacecraft. But this embarrassed NASA, and they decided Gus needed to be punished. As the Apollo program was getting started, Gus was looking like the frontrunner for first man on the moon. He also had a history of criticizing the Apollo 1 capsule, I'll say rightfully here, and its many failures, even going to the press. In Scott's mind, this was the last straw. Without getting into too many dumb details, Scott believes that NASA had Frank Borman and Jim Lovell install a sort of spark bomb, a mechanism designed to start a fire into the capsule to kill Gus Grissom. Ed White and Roger Chaffee were acceptable casualties. For their good work, Frank and Jim were sent on the Apollo 8 mission, becoming the first humans to fly by the moon. And yes, in case you were wondering, in this conception, Apollo 13, which Jim Lovell commanded, was an attempt to kill him and tie up loose ends. God only knows why they decided destroying an entire moon mission was necessary, or why they apparently let Frank Borman off the hook.
I hate conspiracy theories.
I know, it is not even a good story. It's a bad fucking story.
I wish I could transmit the sound of blinking in disbelief through the microphone.
I have
Holy
one
shit.
question. If they were trying to kill someone, wouldn't they have fabricated the story ahead of time of what happened? And then immediately just start blasting it out of, this is what happened to these 3 brave astronauts?
Yeah, you'd think that they would have had the crisis comms lined up.
But Chris, they are simultaneously all powerful and to be feared, but incredibly incompetent. Or they want you to know. They want it to be obvious, so that they're flaunting their ability to get away with it in front of your very eyes by making it very obvious.
We both listen to Too Much Knowledge Fight, Chris.
I want to twist my head off. I want my blood to fountain into the earth as my last gift to this blessed existence.
I have something coming up in the next sentence that will make you feel slightly better.
Just keep going. Just power through.
So, starting in 1996, Scott used FOIA requests to get access to the old Apollo 1 capsule. He brought along a photographer, his lawyer, a writer for a magazine, and his buddy, Rick Booz.
That makes me think that he's all of those in one.
Yeah, this is my photographer, lawyer. He also writes for a magazine. Hey, he's my buddy, Rick Booz. I'm allowed to say that because he says it in the deeply deranged interview. While taking a look around, Scott immediately became obsessed with a part of the control panel that had a hole in it, seemingly where a switch would go. Also, he found, they gave him the plastic baggie that had the switch in it that was supposed to go there. To us, That's probably just something that was removed when the entire spacecraft was dismantled piece by piece. There were other holes in the panel where switches would have gone. To Scott, however, this was the detonator for the spark bomb. Again, God only knows why NASA put the detonator to the bomb that killed Gus Grissom in front of Gus Grissom and presumably waited for him to flip the switch that says kill you instantly.
Also, we have to assume that NASA then completed their cover-up and just left this capsule sitting around till, 1996?
Yeah.
with the hole in it?
And allowed Scott Grissom to, can't you keep him away from... No, sir. He put in a FOIA request.
Well, can we at least put the switch back in? No, we can't do that.
That's against the sanctity of the process.
We can't silence him permanently. He's a free and able citizen of the United States of America.
Choosing to imagine that after James Webb, every other person who led NASA and apparently ran this globe-spanning assassination cabal was just no, we need to respect the Grissom family. Yeah, and just allow him to do this, allow him to find it. Again, the idea that they have this switch, I want to be clear, this switch is in the design documentation. It was always designed to be there. I don't remember exactly what it did, but it did something, and that thing that it did was not blow up a bomb. And again, just the belief that Frank Borman and Jim Lovell snuck in and added something to the spacecraft without either A, the crew of the spacecraft, or B, engineers noticing.
I like the theory that some people just have main character syndrome, where everything that happens must be because you're the main character of some incredible story and plot. And no, actually, shit just happens sometimes.
Especially because Scott Grissom has made it very clear throughout his entire, I want to say, career doing this, that he does not give a shit about Ed White or Roger Chaffee. He considers their families willing participants in the cover-up. He considers them, either whether they knew it or not, collateral damage in the quest to kill Gus Grissom because Gus Grissom embarrassed NASA slightly.
Good God.
Yeah, and again, just this idea that NASA was embarrassed, so they engineered a huge problem to murder a guy, and then because they murdered a guy, that kicked off all of the horrible bad press that NASA got.
They were so embarrassed because they had a capsule sink that, they really needed to get more congressional investigations going on.
I wonder if inside the evil assassination cabal there was a similar situation to the Phillips report where someone was just hey, did you order that guy assassinated? Nuh-uh, no. It's okay, well, what about this letter written in blood with your name and a pentagram on it? Oh shit. Now, in talking about Scott, I'm going to end this with one little tidbit that I found particularly infuriating, which is he gets into because he is the son of an astronaut, he has contacts with other astronauts, and over time he describes them all stopping talking to him, probably because he is an insane conspiracy theorist who thinks that they helped murder his dad. And to him, this reinforces the conspiracy. And near the end of the interview, he says, quote, "Near as I can tell, every astronaut involved in the Apollo program is a co-conspirator." Betty is also brought along for the interview. The interview, by the way, happens in 1999. Yeah, Betty talks about wanting blood, wanting revenge. It's not a fun time. Now, Scott Grissom is by no means the only purveyor of Apollo 1 conspiracy theories. He's just the biggest and the best at it. And even if people aren't alleging that NASA secretly assassinated their own astronauts to cover up something that got exposed in front of Congress anyway, Apollo 1 remains one of the most lied about stories in space history. Just like with Bondarenko, just like with Komarov, the lies probably outweigh the truth. And this is one of those cases where, I don't necessarily think it's malice. I think it's that, I know I said that a lot of conspiracy theories are badly written. Some of them are good. Some of them are well written, and they jump out at people better than the actual truth. Komarov screaming at the Kremlin, denouncing them, while Politburo members weeped into the radio as he burned to death on re-entry, instead of just the actual story. With Apollo 1, for a lot of these conspiracy theories, it's not quite to the Scott Grissom, this was a cover-up kind of stuff. But it's like we talked about last time. If you look up Apollo 1, one of the first things you'll see is people passing off the burnt, empty spacesuits as there's still a person in there. It took hours for them to die. And I don't know. I don't really have like a moral to this lesson. I don't really have like a final righteous rant aside from the one I just gave. It sucks. The only way out of it is going to be more and better public education about space. And I see some of that happening. I see interest in space going up, and hopefully with that, interest in space history will go up, and people will fight the urge to make dumb clickbait articles, objectively get more clicks with dumb sensationalist stories.
If there's one thing I wish I could just illustrate about any sort of space engineering disaster to just the general public, it's watch engineers that read the reports and their reactions to this stuff, because it's never a dramatic story. It's a sigh and a recognition that everything that happened to get to that point was seemingly mundane, just boring, everyday shit of people going to work, doing a thing, not doing it well enough, and then everything going to hell.
Yep.
It's not a grand conspiracy. There's no evil villains. There's no singular person to be angry at, to take out your frustration on. There's not some cabal that you can take revenge on for the bad thing happening. It's just ordinary people doing ordinary people things and not being careful enough. And this is where it gets you.
Yeah. It's this weird thing where I wish NASA and James Webb had been raked over the coals more for the lying and the cover-ups. But at the same time, Apollo happened. Humans did land on the moon. We got several moon, and although Apollo was then cut short for political reasons by Richard Nixon, which is definitely something we're going to talk about a lot in the future, it was still a huge scientific and like research boon for what it was. And while I don't necessarily agree with the dramatizations that say that the Apollo 1 astronauts' deaths was, if not good, at least it was, if it wasn't for them, we would never have made it to the moon. It was bad. It was a huge fuck up. It was a disaster. We can accept that and not have to. This was a necessary thing for the Apollo program, because it wasn't.
I've read a lot of accident reports, and it doesn't do you any good to wax lyrical about, these guys really tragic event, but a sacrifice in the name of safety that had to be made. No, it wasn't. It was a stupid mistake. It should never have happened. We should have been better.
We have the binder full of receipts that prove that it was preventable.
But as a student of history, and especially for any engineers that are engineers out there, you are the people that have the ability to make it mean something. See the patterns that happen, see what goes on. And if you see that happening in front of what you're doing, you can make that not happen again.
And so, everyone, that is the story of Apollo 1. Negligence, bad engineering, and about as close as NASA ever came to a Soviet-style cover-up of a space disaster. How are we all feeling, and what are we all thinking about this?
From the first episode where we heard how many documented errors there were on this pod, documented problems there were in the binder that was just dropped at the feet of NASA QA, and it was just kick-flipped on through.
And then NASA found 40 more.
I want to be like, oh my God, why am I brain farting? The Bond guy with the jaw. Who the hell?
Jaws?
Sure. Yeah, I want to be like that. I want to be able... Can I be on the committee of the snaps ne'er-do-wells in half with my mouth when they lie on a congressional committee? Yeah, I can be trusted as a sole arbiter of right and wrong. I'm a nonpartisan third party that can be trusted to hold people accountable.
Everyone has a little cousin who was a biter. And if you are the little cousin who was a biter,
we have a job opportunity for you.
Bite people who deserve it. Bite people who fuck up engineering.
Bite your local congressman.
And audience, thank you so much for listening to another episode of Failure to Launch and for bearing with us through this entire sordid series. If you would like to support the show or hear more of us, please consider joining up on Patreon. $3 a month gets you access to monthly bonus episodes and all of our dumb movie reviews that we have done. Higher than that gets you Chris narrating a monthly mini-sode, something new we're trying, and you get your names at the end of the episode. So, Kyle, thank you so much for coming on this episode and for not just like bearing through the series, but also providing a lot of actual industry experience and expertise.
Thank you for having me. It's been, if not a strictly fun time, I've been certainly glad to be here.
Thank you for your cool level-headedness in juxtaposition to my frothing madness.
I love how even your frothing madness is delivered in a deadpan tone of just like, I want to murder people. I want to bite. I want to wear the Jaws dentures and bite through someone's jugular. Yeah, and if you're interested in coming back on in the future, we will make sure that it is not a this kind of series.
I would be glad to be back.
Thank you to everyone who has signed up to support the show, and a big shout out to all of our top tier patrons. Our cyborg cats are Boss, Charlie, June, Matt, Spectre Cohen, and Tortilla Baron. Our space dogs are Guy is Best Guy, Ben L, Brandon M, Daddy Bongo, Double Time, Fractal Moonlight, Furious Luddite, Joe, John C, Lens Wipe, Oliver, Sean H, Sensual Kazoo, Sean P, Sparks, Tom M, Verosh T, Wingsmith, and Zim.
Albert count, 22.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Failure to Launch. If you want to follow us, we are Failure to Launch on Blue Sky and FT Launch Pod on Instagram. We also post our episodes with visual aids at Failure to Launch Podcast on YouTube. All music was provided by DJ Danarchy.